At 9:17 a.m. on a humid morning in early 1942, a flight of B-17 Flying Fortresses opened their bomb bay doors over the Solomon Sea. They were flying at 20,000 feet, perfect textbook altitude according to the Army Air Corps manual. Below them, a convoy of Japanese destroyers cut through the blue water like jagged knives. The American bombardiers peered through their Norden bomb sights, devices so secret and complex they were rumored to be able to drop a pickle into a barrel from 4 miles up. The mathematics were calculated, the drift was adjusted, the release levers were pulled. Dozens of 500-pound high-explosive bombs whistled down through the clouds. The crews waited 40 long seconds for the impact, expecting to see the convoy disintegrate in columns of fire and steel. They hit absolutely nothing. The ocean erupted in white geysers of foam 200 yards away from the nearest Japanese ship. The destroyers didn't even break formation. Their captains simply watched the bombs fall, ordered a hard turn to port or starboard, and let the American explosives splash harmlessly into the empty Pacific. It was humiliating. It was a mathematical impossibility that was happening every single day. The Army had spent millions of dollars convincing the world that high-altitude precision bombing was the future of warfare. But out here in the mess of the Southwest Pacific, the future was looking useless. The pilots flew back to their bases in New Guinea, tired, angry, and empty-handed, while the Japanese Tokyo Express continued to deliver thousands of troops and tons of supplies to the jungle front lines without a scratch on their paint. This failure was the nightmare that welcomed General George Kenney when he arrived to take command of the Allied Air Forces in the Southwest Pacific. Kenney was not a man who cared about manuals or polished brass. He was a short, aggressive, harsh-spoken aviator who looked more like a mechanic than a general. He walked with a strut and talked like he was trying to start a fight in a bar. When he landed in Australia, he found an air force that was demoralized and broken. The maintenance crews were scavenging scrap metal to keep planes flying. The pilots were flying suicide missions with tactics that didn't work, and the Japanese Navy was running circles around them. Kenney looked at the reports of the high-altitude bombing raids and threw them in the trash. He knew that trying to hit a destroyer moving at 30 knots from 20,000 feet was like standing on the roof of a skyscraper and trying to drop a marble into a coffee cup that was being dragged by a sprinting cat. The problem was the physics of the engagement. A bomb dropped from high altitude takes nearly a minute to reach sea level. In that minute, a destroyer captain can look up, see the bay doors open, and move his ship half a mile in any direction. The Japanese knew this. They mocked the American bombers. They didn't even bother to scatter. They just danced out of the way and let the ocean swallow the American tax dollars. Kenney realized that if he wanted to stop the bleeding in the Pacific, he had to stop those ships. And if he wanted to stop those ships, he had to get lower. He needed to get down into the spray and the salt, right in the face of the enemy. But he didn't just want to strafe them with machine guns. Machine guns were for shooting down flimsy airplanes. They would bounce off the steel hull of a destroyer like gravel thrown at a tank. Kenney needed artillery. He needed a weapon that could punch through a boiler room or rip the bridge off a warship. He started looking around his hangars for a solution. He saw the B-25 Mitchell bomber. It was a sturdy, twin-engine medium bomber, reliable and tough, but it was designed to drop bombs, not fight like a battleship. Then he looked at the ground equipment. He saw the standard Army 75mm field gun. It was a monster of a weapon, a descendant of the famous French 75 from the First World War. It fired a 15-pound shell that could smash through concrete bunkers and light tanks. It was heavy, violent, and designed to be bolted to the ground or mounted inside a 30-ton Sherman tank. It was absolutely not designed to be bolted inside an airplane. The idea was insanity. Putting a 75mm cannon into a B-25 was like trying to mount a howitzer on a surfboard. The weight alone was a nightmare. The cannon weighed nearly 1,000 pounds. The ammunition weighed hundreds more. And then there was the recoil. When a 75mm field gun fires, it generates a recoil force that feels like a car crash.
On the ground, the gun digs its spades into the dirt to absorb the shock. In a tank, the 30 tons of steel absorb the kick. In an aircraft, there is nothing to absorb the shock except the aluminum frame and the rivets holding the wings together. The engineers at American Aviation, the company that built the B-25, looked at Kenney's request and thought he had lost his mind. They pulled out their slide rules and ran the stress calculations. The numbers came back in bright red ink. They told Kenney that the recoil from the cannon would tear the nose off the aircraft. They said the shock wave would shatter the glass in the cockpit and potentially knock the pilot unconscious. They claimed that even if the plane held together, the sudden deceleration from firing the gun would cause the aircraft to stall in midair, causing it to drop out of the sky like a stone. They wrote long, detailed reports explaining exactly why this was impossible. They used words like structural fatigue, airframe stress limits, and catastrophic failure. They essentially told the general that he was asking them to build a suicide box that would kill his own pilots faster than the Japanese could. They suggested he stick to bombs and machine guns, the things the plane was actually designed to carry. Kenney didn't care about their slide rules. He cared about the Japanese destroyers that were currently unloading troops on Guadalcanal and in New Guinea, while his bombers missed them from the stratosphere. He looked at the engineers and gave them a simple order: throw the manual away. He wasn't asking for permission. He was telling them what was going to happen. He wanted the glass nose of the B-25 removed. He wanted a solid metal nose installed to house the massive breech of the cannon. He wanted the cockpit rearranged so a loader could stand next to the pilot and shove artillery shells into the gun by hand while the plane was bouncing through turbulence at 200 miles per hour. The conflict between the experts in California and the warriors in the Pacific reached a boiling point. The engineers viewed the aircraft as a precision machine, a delicate balance of lift and drag and thrust. Kenney viewed the aircraft as a tool to kill the enemy, and if he had to break the tool to get the job done, he would break it. He argued that the B-25 was over-engineered, that it was tougher than the designers gave it credit for. He told them that in the jungle, his mechanics were patching holes with soup cans and baling wire, and the planes were still flying. He was betting his men's lives on the idea that a chaotic, desperate innovation could beat the carefully calculated perfection of the factory blueprints. The experts finally relented, but not because they agreed. They relented because Kenney was a general with the full weight of the war effort behind him. They agreed to build a prototype, but the skepticism was thick enough to cut with a knife. They called it the B-25G model. To the engineers, it was an aberration, a Frankenstein monster that violated every rule of aeronautical design. To the pilots, it was a terrifying rumor. They heard whispers about a plane that carried a tank gun. They joked that the plane would fly backward when they pulled the trigger. They called it the flying artillery. But beneath the jokes, there was a real fear. They were being asked to fly straight at a destroyer, a ship armed with dozens of anti-aircraft guns, and fire a single shot from a weapon that might rip their own wings off. Kenney sent the order to modify the first batch of planes. He wasn't waiting for the perfect test results. He needed the weapons now. The factory floor at American Aviation became a scene of confused urgency. Beautiful, streamlined glass noses were chopped off. Heavy steel cradles were bolted into the fuselages. The delicate balance of the aircraft was completely destroyed. They had to add hundreds of pounds of lead weight to the tail just to keep the plane from tipping forward onto its nose when it was parked on the runway. It was ugly. It was heavy. It handled like a dump truck, and nobody, not even Kenney himself, knew for sure what would happen when the pilot pulled the trigger for the first time in combat. The stage was set for a disaster or a revolution.
The transformation. Birth of the Lil Monster. The transformation of the B-25 from a medium bomber into a flying gunship did not happen in a sterile laboratory. It happened in sweat-soaked hangars in Townsville and Port Moresby, where mechanics stripped the aircraft down with the brutality of a chop shop operation. The beautiful glazed greenhouse nose, which offered the bombardier a panoramic view of the target, was unceremoniously sawed off.
In its place, the crews installed a blunt, ugly snout made of sheet metal. It looked like the plane had been punched in the face and the swelling hadn't gone down. Inside this metal snout sat the M4 cannon, a weapon so large that the pilot could practically reach out and pat the breech. The installation was a nightmare of plumbing and steel. The recoil mechanism alone, a complex system of hydraulic fluid and heavy springs, took up half the forward compartment. This system was the only thing standing between the pilot and a broken neck. It was designed to absorb the 21-inch kick of the barrel, soaking up the violence of the explosion so the airframe didn't have to. To accommodate this monster, the interior of the plane had to be gutted. The navigator station, usually a place of maps and quiet calculation, was deleted entirely. The bombardier, the man who was supposed to be the star of the show with his Norden bomb sight, was fired. In their place stood a new crew member with the most terrifying job description in the Army Air Corps, the cannoneer. This wasn't a job for a small man. The cannoneer had to stand in a cramped, vibrating tunnel of aluminum right next to the pilot's knees and wrestle with 15-pound artillery shells. There was no automatic loader. There was just a man, a rack of high-explosive shells, and a cannon that smelled of hot grease and cordite. He had to physically shove the shell into the breech, slam the block closed, tap the pilot on the shoulder to signal ready, and then brace himself against the wall while the gun fired mere inches from his head. The engineers back in California had warned that the center of gravity would be ruinous. They were partially right. When the mechanics finished the first modification, the plane was so nose-heavy that the tail wheel lifted off the tarmac. It looked like a sniffing dog. To fix it, they didn't use sophisticated aerodynamic counterbalances. They just bolted lead bars into the tail section until the plane sat flat again. It was a crude backyard solution that added even more weight to an already sluggish aircraft. When the test pilots climbed in for the first taxi runs, they reported that the plane handled like a dump truck with wings. It was heavy, unresponsive, and groaned under the strain of the artillery piece. The sleek, agile bomber was gone. In its place was a flying tank that the crews affectionately and nervously nicknamed the Lil Monster. The moment of truth. Live fire. General Kenney didn't care about the handling characteristics. He cared about the trigger pull. The first live fire test was the moment of truth that would either vindicate him or end his career in a court-martial for negligent homicide. The test plane rumbled down the runway, using nearly every foot of asphalt to heave itself into the humid air. It climbed slowly, struggling for altitude. The target was a small, uninhabited coral reef off the coast. The pilot lined up the nose, fighting the sluggish controls. Inside the cockpit, the tension was thick enough to choke on. The cannoneer slammed the first shell home. "Gun ready," he shouted over the roar of the Wright Cyclone engines. The pilot put the reef in his iron sights. There were no fancy optics here, just a simple post and ring sight bolted to the dashboard. He squeezed the release on the control yoke. The sensation was indescribable. It wasn't just a sound, it was a physical event. The entire airframe shuddered as if it had flown into a brick wall. The plane's forward momentum seemed to pause for a split second, arrested by the sheer physics of Newton's third law. Inside the cockpit, a cloud of acrid white gun smoke filled the air, momentarily blinding the crew. The noise was a deafening thump that rattled the pilot's teeth. But then the smoke cleared. The wings were still attached, the rivets held, the glass didn't shatter, and down on the reef a massive plume of water and pulverized coral erupted exactly where the nose had been pointing. The recoil hadn't stalled the engines, the structural integrity hadn't failed. The California engineers had been wrong. You could put a field gun in a plane, provided you were crazy enough to fly it. Learning to fight. The Green Dragons. With the concept proven, the Green Dragons of the 405 Bomb Squadron began the arduous process of learning how to fight with this new weapon. It required a complete rewriting of the pilot manual. A bomber pilot is trained to fly straight and level to be a stable platform for falling ordnance. A gunship pilot had to be a fighter. The 75mm cannon was fixed forward. It couldn't turn or pivot. To aim the gun, you had to aim the entire plane. This meant the pilot had to dive the massive bomber directly at the target, ignoring the anti-aircraft fire, and hold the nose steady until he was close enough to guarantee a hit. They called it bore sighting. It was a game of chicken played at 200 miles per hour. The effective range of the cannon was technically thousands of yards, but in the chaotic reality of combat, the pilots found they had to get close, suicidally close, 1,000 yards, 800 yards, close enough to see the rivets on the enemy ship. The training was intense. Pilots practiced diving on old shipwrecks, learning the terrifying rhythm of the attack run. Dive, stabilize, fire, recover from the recoil, reload, fire again. The rate of fire was slow, maybe 3 or 4 rounds in a single pass if the cannoneer was fast and didn't pass out from the G-forces. This wasn't a machine gun that sprayed bullets. This was a sniper rifle. You had 1 shot, maybe 2, to hit a moving target while your own plane was bouncing through turbulence. If you missed, you had to loop around and try again, exposing your belly to the enemy guns. The crews learned to coordinate like a football team. The pilot focused on the flying. The co-pilot managed the engines and called out ranges. The cannoneer became a rhythm machine. Load, breach, clear, fire. Load, breach, clear, fire. They practiced until their hands were raw and the cockpit floor was covered in heavy brass casings. Baptism by fire, from barges to destroyers. The first victims of this new weapon were not the mighty destroyers, but the coastal barges and luggers that the Japanese used to ferry supplies between the islands. These were small wooden or rusting steel vessels, usually armed with a single machine gun. The B-25s found them creeping along the coastline at dawn. The engagement was almost unfair. A standard bomb would often punch right through a wooden barge without detonating, leaving a neat hole but failing to sink it. The 75mm high-explosive shell was different. When the first round hit a supply barge near Leh, the result was absolute disintegration. The shell smashed into the hull and detonated inside the cargo hold. The barge didn't just sink, it vanished in a shower of splinters and burning fuel. The pilots returned to base with eyes wide open. They hadn't just damaged the enemy, they had erased them. Word spread quickly through the squadrons. The suicide box was actually a hammer. The skepticism evaporated, replaced by a hungry eagerness. Crews started painting names on their gunships, aggressive names like Ominous Seven Bang, Sunday Punch, and Dirty Dora. They mounted additional machine guns in the nose, surrounding the cannon with 50 caliber heavy machine guns. Now, when a pilot pulled the trigger, he wasn't just firing artillery, he was unleashing a storm of lead that could shred the deck crews before the cannon delivered the knockout blow. They called it the Commerce Destroyer configuration. But hunting barges was target practice. The real test, the one General Kenney had built this Frankenstein monster for, was the Tokyo Express. The Japanese Navy was still running destroyers down the slot, arrogant and untouched. These weren't defenseless barges. A Japanese destroyer was a 300-foot spear of steel, bristling with 25mm autocannons and 5-inch dual-purpose guns. Its crew was disciplined, battle-hardened, and experts at shooting down aircraft. They had watched American bombers fail for months. They had no respect for the B-25. To them, a medium bomber at low altitude was just a large target, a slow-moving duck waiting to be plucked from the sky. The ultimate test, a dance with death. The escalation began in late 1942. The Japanese High Command, frustrated by the slow attrition of their barges, decided to commit a major convoy to reinforce their garrisons on New Guinea. They assembled a fleet of fast transports protected by the destroyer Amatsukase and her sisters. These were the wolves of the ocean, ships that had fought the U.S. Navy to a standstill at Guadalcanal. They steamed south with the confidence of apex predators. On the morning of the interception, the weather was patchy with low clouds hugging the water, perfect cover for a low-level ambush. Major Edens, leading the flight, checked his instruments. His plane, heavily laden with fuel and ammunition, felt sluggish in his hands. He looked over at his co-pilot, then back at the cannoneer, who
Inside the cockpit of the lead B-25, the world shrank down to the size of the ring sight on the dashboard. The pilot gripped the yoke with white knuckles, fighting the turbulence and the instinct to flinch. Tracers lashed out from the ship like fiery whips. At 1,200 yards, he squeezed the trigger for the machine guns. 50 caliber bullets poured out, walking across the water, smashing into the ship's bow and bridge. The hail of lead was meant to blind and suppress. The Japanese gunners were forced to duck. That was the opening. The pilot held the dive. The destroyer filled the entire windshield, a gray mountain of steel growing larger by the millisecond. 800 yards, 700 yards. The cannoneer tapped his shoulder. The gun was hot. The pilot made a micro-adjustment, lifting the nose a fraction to aim for the waterline beneath the forward turret. He stopped breathing. He squeezed the cannon trigger. The B-25 stopped in midair. That's what it felt like. The recoil delivered a punch of kinetic energy equivalent to a collision with a brick wall. The plane shuddered violently from nose to tail. A massive cloud of white smoke belched from the muzzle, blinding the crew. But the 15-pound high-explosive projectile was already gone, crossing the 600 yards of open ocean in less than a second. It struck the steel hull of the Yamatsukaze just above the waterline with the force of a freight train. The 75-millimeter round punched through the half-inch steel plating as if it were wet cardboard. The fuse delayed for a split second, allowing the shell to smash through the outer skin, tear through a bulkhead, and explode deep inside the ship's machinery spaces. The blast shredded steam pipes and electrical conduits, turning the interior into a blender of shrapnel and high-pressure steam. On the bridge, the Japanese officers felt the ship lurch as if it had run aground. They didn't understand what had hit them. It felt like a torpedo, but there was no wake. They never imagined they had just been shelled by an airplane. The B-25 roared over the destroyer's masts, so close the rear gunner could see the panic on the deck. As the pilot pulled back on the stick to climb away, the cannoneer was already moving, wrestling another 15-pound shell into the breach against the crushing G-forces. "Up!" he screamed. The pilot brought the plane around in a tight, aggressive turn. The Yamatsukaze wasn't maneuvering anymore. Smoke poured from a jagged hole in the bow. The ship was listing. The Predator was wounded. On the second run, the pilot aimed for the stern. The cannon barked again. The second shell struck near the depth charge racks. A secondary detonation erupted, a massive fireball blowing debris into the air. The destroyer shuddered and began to slow, dead in the water. The rest of the squadron descended like vultures. They switched to skip bombing, releasing 500-pound bombs that skipped across the water like stones, slamming into the side of the crippled destroyer. The Yamatsukaze groaned, buckled, and began to settle into the water. It hadn't been sunk by a battleship or a submarine. It had been beaten to death by modified bombers that the experts said would never fly. Legacy, from Frankenstein to Founding Father. When Major Edens in his flight touched down at Port Moresby, the aircraft were stained black with soot, their paint blistered. The crews climbed out with shaky legs, their ears ringing, their eyes alive with vindication. The gun camera footage told the story, the burning Yamatsukaze. General Kenney looked at the photos and smiled. He ordered them sent to every engineer at North American Aviation who said the recoil would tear the wings off. The message was clear. The success changed manufacturing priorities overnight. The B-25G and later the H model went into full production. Engineers stopped arguing and started building, adding armor, upgrading recoil mechanisms, and turning the B-25 into the premier street fighter of the Pacific. For the Japanese, the ocean became a terrifying place. Convoys hid, moving only at night. The arrogance of the Tokyo Express evaporated.
The peak came during the Battle of the Bismarck Sea, where skip bombing combined with the gunship's suppressive fire annihilated a Japanese reinforcement fleet. It was the final proof. Air power, applied with violence and ingenuity, could strangle an island nation's supply lines. Yet the reign of the 75mm cannon was intense but short. Technology caught up. The high-velocity aircraft rocket, or HVAR, offered similar destructive power without the recoil or need for a loader. Later B-25s replaced the cannon with a battery of 8 or 12.50 caliber machine guns, becoming flying buzzsaws. But the idea didn't die. It was buried in the archives, waiting. In Vietnam, it was reborn in the AC-47 Spooky with its Gatling guns. Then came the AC-130 Spectre, a transport plane armed with 40mm cannons and a 105mm howitzer, the direct, ultimate realization of Kenney's vision. Every time a Spectre fires today, it echoes the thunder of those first clumsy, terrifying shots over the Bismarck Sea. The engineers said it was impossible. They said the physics wouldn't work. But history is rarely written by the people who say it can't be done. It is written by those too stubborn to listen, by men like General Kenney who looked at a manual and saw only a suggestion, by men like Major Edens who looked at a destroyer and decided to charge it head on. They proved that sometimes the smartest solution is the one that looks the stupidest on paper. They proved that with enough courage and enough gunpowder, you can make a bomber do the job of a battleship. We rescue these stories so that the green dragons and their rattled, smoke-filled cockpits don't disappear into silence. We tell them because they remind us that innovation isn't always about high-tech microchips or sleek aerodynamics. Sometimes innovation is just a big gun, a heavy hammer, and the will to use it.